Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today, Food Fraud. I'm excited to have Doug Marshall here with me today, hosting the webinar. I am Amy Knock, and I will be moderating today's session. Before we begin, I wanted to let you know a little bit more about how this webinar will run. The webinar is being recorded, and the slides and recording will be available for you within 3 business days. A short Q&A session will follow the presentation to answer any viewer submitted questions. During the webinar, you can submit questions you have using the webinar sidebar menu. Select the Questions tab, type in your question, then hit the Enter key on your keyboard. Remember, you can submit questions anytime throughout the webinar. That concludes my brief introduction today. Doug, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Amy. It's really a pleasure to be here with everyone. I can tell you I'm presenting this from northern Colorado, where there is about a 1/4 inch of ice on everything. So it's a good day to be hunkered down in front of your computer, and I'm personally honored you're willing to spend at least an hour with me today. What we're going to talk about today is just a general overview of food fraud. And it's a topic that has a lot of different connotations to a lot of different people. And certainly there are many of us who have been a victim of food fraud, whether we know it or not. And hopefully today I'll be able to define some terms for you to consider. And I'll give you some examples of maybe how widespread food fraud is. And then we'll finish up with some recommendations on how you can better manage your food fraud risk in your respective places of employment. For those of you unfamiliar with the Eurofins group, we are a leading service provider worldwide. So we have over 900 laboratories, over 50,000 employees, and food is one of the largest sectors that we work in. And food includes both food, animal feed, as well as pet food. In addition, you can throw in dietary supplements. At least here in the United States, we have a large number of local laboratories. So you don't have to go very far to get a local service for all of your testing, training, auditing, and consulting needs. For those of you who don't know the origin of Eurofins, the story is, I think, quite interesting. So I want to share that story with you because it has a direct relationship on food fraud. So in 1981, there was a method that was invented that was called the Sniff Nmr Method. Now, Sniff Nmr is an acronym for Site-Specific Natural Isotopic Fraction Deuterium Nuclear Magnetic Resonance. Now, for those of you who like big scientific terminologies, I would argue this is one of the larger ones you'll ever find in the scientific literature. So I think you will appreciate the Sniff Nmr as a short for that. The importance of this test is this was the first one to determine the botanical origin of alcohol, because at the time there was widespread adulteration of wines, and the location of the laboratory where this was invented was in Nantes, France, which is just outside the Bordeaux region of France, which, as you know, is a very famous wine growing region. And because of this invention, one of the sons of Professors Martins started a business around this method, and it was the application of isotopic methods to food testing. And so RMN-FINS is the French acronym for Sniff Nmr. And so the name of the company that Jean Martin decided on was in honor of this first method. So it was Euro attached to FINS. So it was in honor of the original method that got the company started. When you think about business risks, you have to be aware that any food manufacturer is in a risky business. So you have the potential for accidental or incidental contamination. You have economically motivated fraud that could affect your business, either directly or indirectly. If you have a competitor that gets in trouble, then you are likely to lose sales by guilt by association. Those of you who work with sole source ingredient suppliers, whether you're sourcing a commodity that is not in abundant supply, or whether or not you have developed a relationship with a single source supplier, if something happens in that supply chain, you're going to inherit that problem. And then there are many anti-everything campaigns that are out there that can affect your business prospects, both short-term and long-term. This is just a listing of some of those, and many of these can be subject to fraud. So, is your product a GMO containing product or a non-GMO containing product? And how do you know whether the ingredients that you are buying as non-GMO legitimately are non-GMO? Just an example. And so all these other things can be subject to economically motivated fraud activities. Just to share with you some food fraud headlines, I went in and over a single month period, these were some of the headlines that Mr. and Mrs. Google were able to provide for me. And you can kind of look through here and just look. So you've got species substitution, you've got false organic certifications, you've got people arrested for horse meat that's unfit for human consumption, food manufacturing executives sentenced to prison terms because of counterfeit cheese, and on and on and on it goes. So one might argue that contrary to popular belief, food fraud might be the oldest profession in the world. So when you think about food fraud, it comes in very different flavors depending on the angle at which you define what food fraud is. So I want to give you a few definitions because oftentimes they're used interchangeably, but there may be subtle differences that are important to you. So food fraud is just simply, illegal activities used to gain economic benefit or some other motivation using food. And another definition, it can be just deliberate or an intentional substitution, addition, tampering, or misrepresentation. Sometimes this may or may not involve economic gain that could potentially impact public health. There are some other kinds of definitions out there, such as food authenticity. And then FDA uses the term economically motivated adulteration. And this is just simply the fraudulent and intentional substitution or addition of a substance in a product for the purpose of increasing its apparent value and or reducing the cost of its production, all designed with the goal for economic gain associated with the fraudster. Food integrity is another term that is out there. And in this case, it may or may not necessarily be related to fraud, but it could be food that is offered for sale that may not necessarily be representative of what the food is being marketed as. So, there could be some dishonesty associated with, a point of origin or the composition of the food. And then food crime has two common definitions. One is an incident involving food that's a violation of some criminal statute. And number two, it could be food fraud incidents that are conducted on a larger scale. So again, for the purposes of this talk, I'll kind of be using economically motivated adulteration. At the same time, I'll be using the term food fraud. So what are the motivations for fraudulent activity? Well, some examples are you can transship to avoid duties. So for example, when there was a blockade put on certain Chinese products, a lot of these products were shipped to another country, and then they were able to bypass those tariffs because now the country of origin wasn't China, it was, for example, Vietnam. Okay? You can transship to avoid inspections. Again, you may have inspection without cause if you are trying to ship products from locations where there is mandatory inspection involved. If you ship that product to a different country, then sometimes you can bypass that mandatory inspection. There could be diverted products for gray or black market use. So a particular product may have been manufactured and it does not meet the purchase specifications of the customer base. So you may be able to divert that product to another customer base that may not be as stringent with their purchase specifications, or may not be checking through routine verification that those purchase specifications being declared by the seller are actually true. And then lastly, there's economic adulteration for potential gain or to maintain revenue with a particular product line. So hopefully up to now, I've given you the motivation for food fraud, and I've demonstrated a little bit that it occurs widely. So why is it so easy to get away with? Well, number one, there is substantial motivation because there's an opportunity to make an illicit profit. So again, nothing motivates people more than becoming a profiteer and finding an angle to be able to manipulate a marketplace. There could be the presence of cheaper adulterants that could easily mimic another product. And so if you can bring something to market that looks and tastes and smells and feels like the authentic thing, then it's pretty easy to slip in this alternate product and selling it as the real deal. There could be premium food stuff that is in short supply. This is a leading motivator for food fraud. So when there is a huge market demand for a particular commodity or ingredient and that material is in short supply, then anybody who can substitute or mimic that high demand material is going to find a lucrative potential marketplace. So again, when you have high commodity prices and a low availability, then substitution becomes a primary motivator for fraud. Companies that are naive and are buying from unknown suppliers, meaning they're just going out in the marketplace and their purchasing agent has one task, and that's to buy the cheapest tonnage of product X they can find, without really caring whether that product being presented for sale is truly authentic and truly meeting your specifications. There is a robust lax supplier attitudes in many places in the marketplace. And the typical scenario I see on this one is, hey, we've been doing business with this supplier for 40 years. We've never had a problem. We trust them. And when you have that blind trust, then that is a setup for your suppliers to be able to slip you not the number one you think you're buying, but number two and number three, because they know you're never going to do any verification checking. It's also common when there is likely to be more fraudulent issues when you have a long supply chain. So the more hands that are involved in that supply chain, the more opportunity there is for a fraudster to insert themselves into that supply chain and start manipulating that supply. And then, of course, as I've alluded to, companies that are buying these materials, if they're not doing verification testing of their incoming materials, then again, they're using blind trust in that supply chain. And of course, that is a recipe for not well managing food fraud. So here is a quick little test for you, and that is economically motivated adulteration or food fraud associated with these two kinds of products? So on your left, we have processed cheese. So it is yellow in appearance, it looks and it smells, and it's being sold as cheese. But is it the same product as cheddar cheese? So if you were to pass off a block of processed cheese as cheddar cheese, would that be legal or illegal? Well, it would be illegal, but it's okay to sell processed cheese because both of these different products have a US standard of identity that defines the ingredients, the materials, and the presentation of these two respective cheeses. And that's why they have different names. This one might be a little trickier for you. So product A has the following ingredients. It's a very simple food product. So the ingredients are water, there is a sweetener, there is malic acid, and there's caramel color. So can anybody guess what this product is? Well, this is imitation apple juice. So it looks like apple juice, it tastes like apple juice, it smells like apple juice, but it is not apple juice. Now let's contrast that to product B. So the ingredients going into product B are apples, but does the kind of apple matter to what you can call this product? And the answer is no. You could basically put any kind of apple into this product and it can still be called apple juice. But what if you also added some pear juice? Can you still call it apple juice? Well, in this case, it's 100% juice, unlike product A, but because you've adulterated it, so you basically have perhaps substituted a lower priced juice, then in this case, product B, it's authentic juice, but it too would be potentially a fraudulent juice. This is a list of the common high-risk foods that are associated with food fraud activities. And I want to walk you through these just to kind of give you reasons why these are at the top of the fraudulent food chain. So olive oil is particularly suspect to this because there is a premium olive oil on the market called extra virgin olive oil. And this is the fresh squeezed olive oil that is not subject to an organic solvent extraction. So it commands a higher price than a refined olive oil. Both are still olive oil, but they're presented to the marketplace as two different products based on quality attributes. You can also have significant price differentiation depending on the geographic origin of the olive oil. So for example, an Italian olive oil typically will command a greater price than a Greek or a Spanish or a Turkish or a Libyan olive oil, as an example. Then there is a potential for dilution or substitution. So if you have extra virgin olive oil, if you add 5% refined olive oil, I mean, it's still olive oil, but you're reducing your cost to production of that mass. So it's still going to look like extra virgin, still going to taste like, but just that small amount of dilution can add extra profit back to the manufacturer because you're adding a lower cost substitution to that product. Likewise, you can also substitute with non-olive oil materials such as other kinds of vegetable oils. So again, just a small amount can result in extra profit to the manufacturer. Then we have flavorings. So a good example would be the differentiation between natural vanilla flavor versus vanillin, which is a synthetic compound that mimics the flavor of natural vanilla. We have lots of fruit substitutions, like the example I gave you with apple juice. Then we have sweeteners. Again, the high demand, pricier sweeteners such as honey or agave syrup. Just rampant substitution of those, because again, you can add alternative sweeteners. Usually it's a corn-based sweetener. And you don't have to add a lot to be able to add extra profit and increase the mass that you're manufacturing. Then we have vinegars, and in this case, the classic example is a balsamic vinegar, which you can mimic pretty easily, and you charge a huge premium over something that would just be a wine vinegar, for example. Juices and wines, we've talked about that. Seafood substitution is one that I personally have been a victim of many, many, many times at the food service level and at the retail level. So if you have a whitefish fillet that's being presented as halibut, but you're actually substituting it with tilapia, then you're taking a $30 a pound name and substituting it with a $5 a pound fish. So the average consumer, if they just go to their restaurant and they want a piece of fried fish, they're not going to know the difference between a snapper, a halibut, and a tilapia, for example. Nothing wrong with tilapia, but it's not halibut, right? Alcoholic beverages, again, we hear some examples of this at the food service level, where you may order a top shelf brand, but the bartender is pouring you a bottom shelf liquor. So very difficult for you to detect that unless you have a very sensitive palate. And you know, if you're at the beach resort in Cancun and you're wasted most of the day, by the end of that third drink, you're probably not going to be able to differentiate whether it's Tito's or something else. Dietary supplements, I would encourage everyone on this call to tune in for another webinar we're going to have on dietary supplement authenticity testing. But this one is a common occurrence as well. And then lastly, anything else where the reward to adulterate is going to exceed the risk of getting caught. So I gave you the list of the most common ones, but by all means, these are not the only ones. I'm not going to go through the list that you see here, but if you're a manufacturer, you source ingredients from any one of these sources, then I would argue you are at risk of food fraud. And you should be doing something in your supplier verification program to help you detect fraudulent activity from your supply chain, but more importantly, to keep your suppliers honest, because they're going to have to exert some effort to make sure that the products that they're sourcing from their supply chain are meeting everyone's purchase specifications. So, is economically motivated adulteration a food safety issue? And I will tell you that it is not intended to cause a public health harm, usually. And the rationale for that is any casualties amongst the consumer is not a long-term marketing successful story for a fraudster, because that's going to reduce the potential for repeat business. So just be aware, however, that fraudsters do make mistakes. But a lot of these folks are very, very clever people. They hire brilliant scientists to be able to come up with fraudulent materials. So it is an arms race to be able to, number one, detect fraudulent activity in order to keep that supply chain honest. Remember, too, that economically motivation is intentional. This becomes the scary part, because if you are a successful fraudster, then you can evade all the private sector quality assurance systems that are in place to be able to detect fraud. And you're also able to evade any government inspection and surveillance systems that may be looking for fraudulent activities. So think about this. If adulteration for profit is achievable, then adulteration for harm also is a possibility. So when we think about the history of food fraud harm, I want you to think about some of these examples. So there were some fraudulent activities that have actually led to consumer morbidity and mortality. So these are some of the examples. So there was a oil substitution event that killed several hundred in Spain. There was dioxin that was found in food that resulted in a massive recall. The melamine incident in China was a huge deal, not only in China, but worldwide. And there were 6 infant mortalities associated with that. Around the world, we continue to see methanol as an illegal ingredient in distilled spirits because of poor fermentation and distillation processes. And methanol is a toxicant, and it kills people. We had the horse meat scandal in the EU. There was potential for an illegal growth promoter in that horse meat. We don't think there were any illnesses associated with it, but there was that potential. There was illegal levels of an insecticide found in eggs at concentrations that were 100 times greater than the MRL, and just a little bit less than 100 times less than, or excuse me, a little more than 100 times less than the presumed lethal dose. So again, the margin of safety was very narrow in this particular circumstance. We also have the potential for adverse outcomes, including death, when manufacturers fail to control allergens in their products. Now, we know that allergens are proteins, and you cannot kill proteins by cooking or common sanitation practices like you can microbes. And sensitive individuals who can be exposed to food allergens can experience respiratory distress, potentially leading to death. And the regulatory action level is a 0 tolerance. So let me give you an example that peanut allergy can occur with exposure to 0.1 milligrams of peanut. And when you think about how much of peanut that is, you know, a single peanut kernel weighs about 2,500 milligrams. So that is a lethal dose to, you know, 20,000 peanut sufferers if you had an undeclared peanut in product. We also know that in the US, food allergens are the leading cause of recalls. So companies have a substantial vested monetary interest in controlling food allergens in their products beyond just a public health obligation. So let's address the question of, okay, if Dr. Marshall said that food fraud is common and happens everywhere, how come we don't have a lot of these events in the US? And the answer is because we don't have a lot of regulatory emphases on controlling food fraud events. So our regulatory environment is such that they are severely underfunded, and the vast majority of food fraud events do not result in a public health hazard. And it is the regulator's opinion that it is up to the manufacturers to deal with the economic fraud that is associated with these circumstances. So the regulators will get interested when there is a public health impact due to a food fraud event. In the EU, there is a very different mindset in the regulatory community and amongst the consuming public. So I want to give you an example of a criminal action that was taken, and these happen periodically. And this action was a joint Interpol operation called Opson 5. There have been subsequent Opson criminal investigations, but they're similar to the results of this one. So I just want you to look at some of these results. So this was run over a little over a 3-month period across 50 different jurisdictions. And the investigators looked at shops, markets, airports, seaports, and they were pulling food and beverage products, and they were doing testing of those products to see if they were authentic or if they were fraudulent. And what they found was enough evidence they were able to do over 3,500 criminal cases. Remember, this is a little over a 3-month period. There were 41 individuals that were arrested. Over 11,000 metric tons of food were seized and taken out of the marketplace. Over nearly 1.5 million liters of beverages were pulled from the marketplace, and over 5 million different products were found to be fraudulent. Folks, I don't know about you, but these are gigantic numbers. And this is in a jurisdiction where they actually do go after fraudulent activity. So because there is a lot more investigation done in EU member countries, if you're a fraudster, do you think that North America would be ripe territory because no one is looking? And I would argue the answer is probably yes, or duh. So the top problem products that they found were, number one, condiments. So these would be fraudulent vegetable oils, vinegars, sauces and seasonings, and so forth. And of course, olive oil was a big component of that list. There were fruits and vegetables that were a major problem with look and appearance and texture adulterants, such as copper sulfate in olives that set that green pigment in olives. Well, guess what? Copper sulfate is legal in the US. Alcoholic beverages, one of the ones that was highlighted was there was a propylene glycol added as an illegal sweetener to a sparkling wine. And seafoods, again, species substitution was common. And then sugar and sweets, and the one that was highlighted here was that sugar that was bulked with fertilizer. And so these were just nitrogen granules that were white, had the same appearance as a sugar crystal. And so in order to bulk up that sugar that was being sold, they just added nitrogen fertilizer. The key thing here to consider, however, is that about 20% of the seizures, those products had food safety implications. So again, that's the scary number, right? I want to give you another example here in the US. So in 2015, there was a single occurrence of an individual who had an adverse reaction to a product. So it was a taco seasoning mix. The individual knew they had a peanut allergy. The taco seasoning mix did not have peanut listed as an ingredient, so they felt as if it was safe. They used it to make up some taco meat, And as soon as they took a bite, they had an adverse reaction. So they reported it to FDA. The taco seasoning manufacturer did a test, and lo and behold, it tested positive for peanut allergens. So during the traceback, they traced back one of the ingredients of that taco seasoning mix was ground cumin, and it too had peanut protein. So the question I want to ask you based upon this event, was that peanut protein in the ground cumin, was that unintentional adulteration? So where this was grown in Turkey, they would also grow peanuts in the same fields, and sometimes you could double crop during a year. Sometimes you could grow a crop of peanuts. Then the next year you could plant cumin or plant soybeans or whatever. So there could be the use of common growing equipment, common harvesting equipment, common processing equipment, where there could be incidental contamination or cross contact of that cumin that could lead to a potential adverse event. On the other hand, could it have been intentional adulteration? So ground peanut shells, which of course is a waste product of peanut processing, if you grind that up, it's going to have the visual appearance that looks very similar to ground cumin, for example. And so again, it could have been added as a bulking agent to dilute that cumin to be able to sell a cheaper product on the marketplace. So which is it? And I think the answer is we don't know, because the Turkish government impeded a thorough investigation to be able to answer this question. But I can tell you the Turkish spice manufacturers, their business of all products was significantly impacted due to this event, and they have really stepped up their game to make sure that Turkish spice products are not sullied in the marketplace again. All right, so what are some food fraud consequences for you? So what's the price you pay for dealing with fraudulent materials? We don't know what that number is in the US, but we do at least have some data in the UK, and it's estimated there's 11 billion pound annual loss in the UK alone. That's a gigantic number. We do also know that if you are splashed all over the news as vending a fraudulent product, whether intentional or unintentional, it doesn't matter, you're going to suffer long-term brand damage. And there's also the potential for public health issues. So because of these public health issues, then, if you are part of a GFSI-based auditing program, you must conduct a food fraud vulnerability assessment. What should that assessment look like? So these are some of the components and some of the questions you should be asking. So, you're trying to define your risk. Once you've defined your risk, then you can start applying some control measures. So these are some questions you should ask. And if you answer yes to any one of these, then I think your risk is being defined for you. If you answer no, how certain are you that the true answer is actually no? So if you don't do any surveillance monitoring, then you are wild ass guessing. So what kind of verification things should you be doing? So you could conduct one or more of the following activities. So you could review your supplier records for controlling food fraud risk of that ingredient. So, what is your supply chain doing to minimize the risk of fraud? You could do on-site audits of your suppliers. Now that might be easy if you are dealing with suppliers that are supplying only product in your country of origin. But what if you have to go overseas to be able to do this investigation? That costs you money, costs you time, and you may not actually get access to the entirety of that supply chain. So there still may be gaps in your risk assessment. Obviously, I'm biased. I work for a food testing business, but sampling and testing by the supplier or by you, the receiving facility, is the ultimate verification activity that the material that you're receiving from your suppliers does not have potential for adulteration. What I would encourage you not to do is this way of attempting to verify your supply chain, and that's crossing your fingers, closing your eyes, and looking up at the sky and hoping that you are sourcing materials from people who care. So these are some situations where you need to think about how to do your verification activities. So when you're vetting your supply chain, you should have some things in your contract that forces your suppliers to do risk reduction strategies for food fraud. And if you don't, then I think you're setting yourself up to being a vulnerable buyer. You should also be scanning the regulatory horizon to see whether or not there are companies out there that are showing up with regulatory actions when it relates to food fraud activity. And if you're doing business with those suppliers, that certainly defines your risk. Do you have historical test or audit results from your suppliers that indicates a trend, whether it's positive or negative? I mean, if the supplier is taking care of business, again, that's evidence that defines your risk. If you have a supplier that has a history of problems, but you know they've taken actions to address those problems, how do you know whether those actions have been effective, have been appropriate, and are still being implemented? Supply chain program review is important. So again, look at what they're doing to control economically motivated association. All right, I'm going to end my talk and talk to you about some analytical methods that can be used to help you discover whether or not you are dealing with fraudulent materials, but also allows you to gain more confidence in your supply chain. So when we think about testing, we can block these into two broad buckets. One are targeted methods, and this is where we're using very specific, very targeted testing, going after maybe one or just a few analytes, because those are the components that are most easily substituted. So again, you could look at protein levels, you could look at freezing point depression levels, you could look at lactose reduction, all associated with a very simple product, and that's milk. Right? You could also do non-targeted methods. So in this case, you're using usually chromatographic profiling, and you're looking at whether or not the fingerprints of that profiling either matches the authentic material, or there is a variance or a deviation from that authentic profile. And based upon that profile, then you can do a lot of different screens for a lot of different fraudulent activities. So the advantage of targeted methods is it's very specific, so you're really looking for one or a small number of attributes, and the presence or the levels of those attributes allow you to be very discriminatory in answering the question, is it fraudulent or is it not? And we are usually doing this because we're targeting a known fraud event. The analytical methods vary greatly depending on the nature of your target. And the good thing is, because you're looking at maybe one component, is once you get an analytical method developed for that component, then it allows for normalization, it allows for the test to be accredited. And so the laboratories performing these assays, the level of accuracy and precision of the method is quite good. Non-targeted methods, we consider these the ultimate weapon against food fraud, because it allows you to look at a much larger array of attributes in a material, and allows you to maybe detect multiple different kinds of fraudulent behaviors. In this case, you're doing whole matrix analysis. You could potentially detect new or emerging fraud activities. And again, you're usually using high resolution spectroscopic methods that require some very sophisticated multivariate statistics to be able to tease out these minor differences in those fingerprints that might be associated with fraudulent activity. Just remember that the fraudsters are very clever, and they know that you're going to be out there looking to find them. And so they're going to try and make sure that whatever the fraudulent activity that they're doing can escape detection by either targeted or by more widespread fingerprinting methods. So I just want to run through some of the ones that we use in our laboratories so you get a feeling for what we can do for you. So we have things like physical chemical methods. So you're just testing for the composition of the food. So, you know, good old ordinary proximate analysis, moisture, fat, protein, carbohydrate, and ash can sometimes help you find material that could not be authentic material. We've got molecular biology methods where, again, we're looking at the presence of DNA markers that tell us whether products could be GMOs, tell us we can authenticate and identify potential for species substitution, and so forth. We have, again, the spectroscopic methods. These are some examples, and then we have the original methods that Eurofins developed over 30 years ago. So we've got Sniff Nmr, and we have isotope ratio mass spectroscopy. Some more examples here. We can do Sniff Nmr for geographic origin, so the soils in which a plant is grown or the animal is grazed has unique chemical isotopes in that soil that carries into the edible tissue of the plant or the animal. And once we know what that isotope fingerprint is for those particular soil types, then we can trace those isotopes back in the product and tell you whether or not the product is, for example, olive oil from Italy versus olive oil from Spain. Let's see, we got organic acid profiles can be used for fruit juice authentication, sugar profiles, polyphenols and anthocyanins. Fingerprints can tell us what the botanical origin is of some products. We've got illegal saccharide profiling for the addition of different kinds of sweeteners. And then we can look for a mycotoxin. This is one of my favorite examples in apple and pear juice to verify that it's actually apple and pear juice, because patulin is produced by Penicillium expansum, which is the causative organism of apple and pear rot. And so we will find low levels of patulin in authentic apple and pear juice. If we don't find patulin, then that is suggestive that that pear juice is probably artificial pear juice rather than the real deal. You know, organic products usually command a premium in the marketplace. So if you can pass off your non-organic product as organic, you can capture that delta profit, and that's good business, right? And so how do you determine whether a product is actually organic versus non-organic? Well, one way you could potentially think about doing this is do a pesticide screen. GMOs, we already talked about that. Undeclared allergens, we have lateral flows and ELISA tests. Sale of dangerous materials, these are products that either intentionally or unintentionally have harmful materials associated with them that has not been taken care of in the supply chain. And so again, you may have an ingredient supplier that runs a test, and if it's out of spec, they're not going to sell that to their traditional buyers, but they're going to divert that into a naive supply chain and maybe pass it off. And you could have harmful substances in these ingredients. Could be process-related contaminants. This is a list of some of those. And then you have things like particle size mimetics. So you've got powdered materials, you've got crystal materials. We have situations where small plastic pellets that are the same size as rice grains being used to adulterate some of the more high value rice cultivars. Oftentimes we have to use a number of very targeted tests and combine those to be able to get an answer to whether or not a material is authentic or not. So the International Olive Oil Council has an accredited testing program, and Eurofins Central Analytical Laboratories down in New Orleans is a US lab that can do this Olive Oil Council accredited testing. And so what you're looking for is fatty acid composition, triglyceride composition, sterol composition. If you're also asking about, is this olive oil produced in geographic location A, B, or C, then you can do NMR spectroscopy. Here's another example that caused rather substantial economic harm to the manufacturer. And so this was a project that I was called in to work on. So this is a dipping sauce manufacturer. They manufactured several large lot sizes over a week. They began getting consumer complaints that the product had lost its viscosity. So no longer was it dipping sauce. It had solidified into a Play-Doh-like consistency. So what went wrong? Well, the only change that we discovered was that the purchasing department had found a new supplier of a cheaper garlic product. And the production and food quality staff was not informed of this change. They didn't recognize that this could have implications on the final product. And what we discovered was that garlic contained flour starch material that gelatinized during processing and formed a firm set after cooling in the containers. So I'll ask you the question, was the garlic fraudulently represented as ground garlic? Or was the flour starch material added as a flow aid? So again, it may be that the garlic manufacturer was selling the recipient material that they did declare that this was added as a flow aid. Just the recipient didn't do their due diligence and think about what the risk was changing suppliers. So not a food safety risk. Maybe it wasn't even an economic fraud situation, but it was a situation where changing that ingredient supplier changed the performance of that ingredient in an application. Here's an example where good old-fashioned sensory analysis could potentially help you detect a fraudulent material. So in this case, the ingredient shown here had a different aroma profile than the other ingredients, and so that was an outlier, and so that was a suspicious ingredient in this particular test. Here's an example where there was an HPLC chromatogram done. Here, a processor was using 2 suppliers of a key ingredient. They began getting customer complaints, and they were trying to do a root cause. And they did an HPLC profile, and what they found was that one of those ingredients from one of those 2 suppliers had a material in there that was not performing well, and it turns out that that material was a sanitizer residue. So the equipment had not been thoroughly washed out after doing a cleaning and sanitation event. Here's an example of just using good old near-infrared spectroscopy to be able to detect adulteration of turmeric by the addition of corn powder. So corn powder is yellow. It can look a little bit like turmeric. And again, if turmeric is a high-value spice product, you don't have to adulterate with a lot of material to be able to gain profit. So this shows you how you could readily detect dilution of turmeric with corn powder. Okay, getting close to the end, if you want more information about food fraud, there is a very nice book that Eurofins contributed to. It is downloadable at that URL. And just want to remind you that Eurofins is here to serve, so we can help you do your risk assessment, and clearly we can help you do your verification testing to help you reduce the risk that you inherit from your supply chain. Amy, I'm ready to turn it over to you for Q&A and what time we have left. And to audience members, thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Doug. And I'm just going to add a quick poll here. Again, if you could let us know if you would like someone to follow up with you after the webinar, that would be great. And as Doug mentioned, we will move into the short Q&A here. The first question that has come in, Doug, for you, if an ingredient in a recipe is substituted with a cheaper version, but with the same quality and specifications, is it considered a fraud?
Okay, very good question. If the ingredient is meeting your purchase specifications and you have no functional issues and it is basically the same, the name of the ingredient is the same, then no, that is not a fraudulent behavior on your part.
Okay, great. Thank you. And the next question, this is what Eurofins locations are capable of performing testing to determine if products are adulterated, and what is the process to determine what to test for? Or is this similar to ID testing for dietary supplements?
Yeah, we have a number of laboratories worldwide. Our Authenticity Center of Excellence worldwide is in Nantes, France. But we do have a number of laboratories in North America that can do some, but not all of these tests. So what I would encourage you to do is to work with your current key account contact, and you can get access to the entire authenticity testing network through your local laboratory. So that would be the best place to start, is to start with your local contact. And then we'll work with you to define what your testing needs are, and we can develop a test protocol that meets your needs.
Wonderful. Thanks, Doug. The next question, regarding the spice substitution, is the PRC method as good as the old botanical analysis?
Okay, it really depends on the nature of the product that you're analyzing. So we do have the ability to do what's called filth and extraneous, as well as non-PCR based identifications. So sometimes that is a sufficient method for determining authenticity. If you have a broad mix of botanicals in a particular product, if you do PCR testing, you may not be able to determine the level at which you may have an adulterant. So you're just testing for the presence of genetic material that's associated with a particular species, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how much is there. And so that may be a challenging thing if you're trying to differentiate, is it incidental agricultural contamination where you can't really remove that material during normal processing? Or is it because there was actually intentional adulteration, but with PCR, you may not be able to tell how much of substitution is involved. So you can use both methods. It depends on the question you're trying to answer.
Wonderful. Thank you, Doug. And I think that wraps up. I've been looking in the chat here. I think that wraps up the questions. We're all caught up. So again, I want to remind everyone that a recording of the webinar, along with a copy of the slides, will be available to you within 3 business days. And thank you again, Doug, for your presentation. And thanks everyone for attending.
Bye-bye.
Bye.